So some of you have probably seen, and I know there was a conversation about conservative communism in the chat. I didn't want to jump in on that because I don't define myself as a conservative communist. I don't even think like Haas or of infrared or any of those guys can like self-label as that. Maybe I'm wrong. But, what we have been talking about, like Midwestern Marx has always been in favor of the liberation and the struggle of oppressed groups, oppressed communities, minority communities. We've done lots of videos about feminism and the women's struggle and talked about how class struggle and these other struggles need to always be intertwined, and how, true liberation, like women's liberation, trans liberation, black liberation, things like that are all need the class struggle, because the ruling class utilizes racism, bigotry, xenophobia in order to keep the masses divided. So only by struggling against them materially can we truly bring about liberation for people. But we need that class struggle, right? We need that class element. Class is what's universal. Class is what binds us all together, despite our various identity groups or despite cultural differences. We have more in common with the working class of any country than we do with our own ruling class, our own capitalist class, which is what we've been getting at, and that is what Dr. Hans-Georg Moeller is getting at with his criticism of what he calls wokeism. So I've recommended the original video here or an original video here from Carefree Wandering or Hans-Georg Moeller a lot of times, called Wokeism, where he basically, and Hans-Georg Moeller is a German philosopher right now studying and teaching in China. I believe he's a Marxist. But what he says is that in the American academies, in the Western academies, and in the Western left, identity politics and issues of identity are being placed over issues of class and are actually being used as a way to distract from issues of class. Race essentialist politics are being pushed rather than class essentialist politics, right? And this is most obviously exemplified by the U.S. empire, by the CIA doing these recruitment videos where they market themselves as very woke, as very progressive, as very inclusive to different gender identities, different sexual identities, different racial and ethnic identities. Um, and, again, going back to class, the only way to identify who the imperialists are, and who is actually doing these acts of imperialist aggression is now by class, right? By understanding that these organizations like the CIA serve the ruling capitalist class, not any one, identity of people. And, regardless of what identity you are, if you're going to help the CIA do imperialism, they're going to accept you. And the irony is, helping the empire actually prevents the liberation of various depressed identity groups, right? So the empire is co-opting the struggle of different oppressed groups, bringing it into the fold of imperialism and using it to try and maintain the status quo. And Dr. Hans-Georg Moeller compares this to what he calls German guilt pride, which is something that happened in Germany after World War II, where there was basically a competition between all the leftists to say, I'm the most sorry about World War II. I'm the most sorry about Hitler. I hate my own home country. And it sort of becomes like a form of reverse nationalism, which prevents organizing and struggle to make the nation better, the country better. So he compares it to that. And then he also compares it to civil religion, right? He says in the past, imperialism has used Christianity, right? You just need to believe in this authority. You need to work hard. We need to spread freedom and we need to evangelize other countries, bring civilization and our correct religion elsewhere. And this was the ideology of imperialism, or the religion of imperialism, which is part of the ideology of imperialism. And Hans-Georg Moeller is saying that now wokeism, for many, many, many Americans, and I think he says the majority of Americans, wokeism has replaced Christianity as the civil religion, right? We need to invade Afghanistan and occupy them for women's rights, or the CIA is now a good thing because they have non-binary people on their staff, right? Using various gender identities to try and justify the most horrific capitalist imperialist actions. And in doing so, they distract people from where this imperialist violence and all the bad things about capitalism are stemming from, which is the capitalist relation. Of course, we know it's not stemming from any one identity group, although, in the US, traditionally white supremacy has, of course, been used, and homophobia have traditionally been used to prop up the existing ruling class. But Hans-Georg Moeller here is kind of noticing a shift in strategy, right? A shift where they're like, we're still race essentialists, right? We're still going to use race to keep the working masses divided. But we won't be explicitly racist, because there's been so much struggle against racism and against the militarized racist police in the US that the ruling class has no choice but to co-opt it, right? To take it and make it a ruling class ideology. And that's what wokeism is really to Hans-Georg Moeller. So he did another video about it here recently. Carlos wrote him, I know, recently with a paper that he did, sort of expanding on some of Hans-Georg Moeller's work and using it to analyze imperialism. So I don't know if that influenced this video from Hans-Georg Moeller. It could have. I know he read Carlos's work, but I'm sure he has lots of good people writing him that encourage him to make more videos or think or flesh this theory out a little more broadly. So without any further ado, let's watch this new video he released. He's now done like 4 or 5 videos on wokeism, but this one is called Woke: The 5 Essentials You Need to Know.
I'd like to talk about wokeism again, about the 5 essentials of wokeism. And I'd like to do so by talking about an essay written by Christopher Mott, a US-based political scientist.
Let me know if it's too quiet or too loud.
And an interview Mott gave with Max Blumenthal on the Gray Zone. Number 1, wokeism is good or God for the imperium. Mott writes, social justice causes and rhetoric are adopted as the explicit goals of the United States foreign policy. Such use and weaponization of the language of justice to advance the foreign policy objectives is particularly evident against regions and countries the West believes actively challenge the liberal international order, status quo, or where it seeks to justify military and economic interventions on normative grounds.
Sorry, I had myself muted. This is nothing new for the empire, really, right? They're co-opting now social justice struggles, but they've always told us, country A is abusing human rights. We need to go in and stop them. The DPRK is abusing human rights. We need to carpet bomb their country and kill 20% of their population. Iraq and Afghanistan, we have to go in there because they're abusing human rights. They're abusing women's rights. Ignore Saudi Arabia, who's backed up by the U.S., who's been backed by the U.S. for years, who in 2018 just finally allowed women the right to drive. Forget the U.S.'s allies. They're not abusing human rights. These countries the U.S. wants to destroy are abusing human rights. And it's always abstract, right? It's always idealist. The U.S. very, very never systematically explains how many human rights abuses a country has to make before we invade or whatever. It's just whatever country we don't like, they're abusing human rights, and therefore that's the only reason we need to invade them. Right now they're using, this country's abusing women's rights. This country doesn't have good LGBTQ rights. China doesn't. We need to sanction them and attack them and do destabilization towards them. This is becoming sort of the new face and the new rhetoric that the empire uses to justify invading countries for human rights.
And then he writes, the military-industrial complex is perfectly capable and incentivized to assimilate their social justice advocates' language and repurpose it for its own internationalist or militarized ends. Wokeness, after all, is good for the imperium. Whether it's good for the nation that hosts the imperium, however, is a very different question. 2 examples for how the military-industrial complex utilizes and reappropriates wokeism. One is a video that Mott and Blumenthal discuss in their conversation. And it's a new woke US Army advertisement that shows an LGBTQ person as some kind of a model soldier, clearly appropriating woke imagery for the purpose of promoting the US military and, of course, thereby promoting the activities of the US military. The second example is the recent visit by Nancy Pelosi to Taiwan, where she also, at least on the side, spoke about LGBTQ issues and so forth. Now, here too, wokeism is utilized for highlighting a very strong difference between the US and by extension the West and somehow the evil forces that oppose it.
Very true. Shoot, I forgot what I was gonna say. Dang it, I totally forgot what I was gonna say. Either way, we'll just keep watching.
And it is used to justify the...
Yeah, I remembered what I was going to say. The other day on stream, we broke down Human Rights Watch doing this investigation of conversion therapy in China, right? And the title was Conversion Therapy is Rampant in China. And then Human Rights Watch is a U.S. Western-backed NGO who's supposed to do investigations or investigative reports. So then they're often used as a source by Western corporate media. So CNN, MSNBC, these other outlets. Oh, did I lose internet connection? It says I lost all my viewers. Okay, we're back. We're back. Sorry, I glitched out there for a second. Hopefully that doesn't happen again. But Human Rights Watch was doing this report about China, saying that they were doing conversion therapy. And then we dug into the report on stream. The evidence for their report was 17 anonymous phone calls. 17 anonymous people who called Human Rights Watch or were contacted by Human Rights Watch and said, yeah, I had this experience in China where basically I was shamed by my family for being gay, and they tried to take me to a doctor to turn me not gay, and it didn't work. And that stuff is horrible, right? That stuff is horrible. The fact that people face discrimination from their family for being LGBTQ, and then that their family would want them to get medical help for something that they're born with, and that doesn't need to be treated medically or can't be treated medically. But Human Rights Watch and all of U.S. media were in unison accusing China of doing conversion therapy. And therefore, of course, we need to sanction China or investigate China, or the UN needs to condemn China, or we need to invade China. When in the US, conversion therapy is still legal in more than 50% of our states. There's like 25% of states still allow conversion therapy, and there's 3 or 4 states that have laws protecting conversion therapy, saying, no, you can't get rid of conversion therapy. It goes in the reverse. Yet these 17 anonymous phone calls require all of US media to attack China and say they're not as woke as us. They're not as, accepting of LGBTQ people as us. Therefore, we need to do imperialist aggression, which is extremely problematic, especially when you look at the US and you realize that we're legally doing conversion therapy. There was a study a few years back that found Americans are paying millions of dollars on conversion therapy every single year. But where is the investigations into the US? Where are the investigations into our abuses of human rights? Where was the US media on this? Their goal wasn't actually ever to call out human rights abuses. It wasn't ever to protect the LGBTQ community. Their goal was to threaten China and to make a report that makes China look anti-woke. So when we criticize wokeism, and I know this is going to be impossible for Twitter Marxists to understand, when we criticize wokeism, we're not criticizing the LGBTQ struggle or the LGBTQ community. We're criticizing the empire co-opting that struggle and using that struggle to justify aggression towards China, when we should be turning the mirror or turning the, magnifying glass on ourselves, and looking at how our own government and how our ruling class oppresses the LGBTQ community here. But we don't do that because it's not actually liberation that they're interested in. It's not liberation that the ruling class likes. It's wokeism, which is liberation co-opted. Liberation of oppressed communities co-opted and used as rhetoric to justify destroying other countries with imperialist, pro-capitalist violence. And I mean, like, Vaush is like the human embodiment of that. Country X is evil. They don't have the woke policies that I prefer. Let's just sanction them and destroy them. You rah rah, US and NATO. vouches the human embodiment of woke imperialism.
Western military presence all over the world. Now, importantly, no matter how one sees this, Nancy Pelosi here clearly, and I think quite intentionally, uses wokeism in order to highlight tensions. This is very different from the approach of leftist Western politicians, for instance, in the 1970s. At that time, the newly elected German leftist chancellor, Willy Brandt, was famous for his so-called Entspannungspolitik, détente policy. He actually even got the Nobel Peace Prize for it. And very much different from today's wokeism. At that time, leftist politicians tried to decrease tensions between the West and the East, and instead tried to promote forms of mediation that led to demilitarization. Today, with wokeism, we see the exact opposite dynamism unfolding. In this sense, I think Mott is right. Wokeism is appropriated for basically US-American geostrategic and European internationalist and militarist purposes. But what is religious about this? What is civil religious about this? Well, I think quite clearly wokeism has replaced Christian religion as the main ideological justification for global expansion. Instead of the Christian salvation narrative, we now have a liberation narrative focused on human rights. Number two, wokeism is a, but not the, civil religion. Mott speaks of a wokist incarnation of American globalist evangelism. And he traces wokist civil religion back to what he calls a certain idealistic and moralistic element in Anglo-American culture that dates back to the rise of Puritanism in the 17th century. So what are the religious or civil religious elements that link American Puritanism in the 17th century with wokeism today? I think there are basically three characteristics that the two have in common.
And I talked about the piece Carlos wrote, responding to Hans-Georg Moeller. This is one of the things he hit on. He first hit on how wokeism is used by the empire. But he then talks about wokeism's roots in philosophy and tries to trace wokeism's roots in philosophy, which Hans-Georg Moeller obviously traces it through a religious line, says it stems from religion. And Carlos, I think he agrees with that, but he says it also stems here in philosophy. You have liberal philosophers who want to put individualism and identity politics above, any kind of material class struggle. So hopefully we'll be able to publish Carlos's work on that here soon, and y'all will know what he's talking about because we've covered Hans-Georg Moeller.
Number one, a certain claim of moral superiority, a certain uncompromising emphasis on thick values that we have and the others lack. Number two, a certain messianic zeal, a missionary spirit, the insistence on the need to spread our values universally. And then, along with this, thirdly, a strong dualistic good-evil distinction. In line with the pariah principle, there is no room left for mediation. You're either with us or against us. Importantly, I think this shows how wokeism actually connects very well with Jordan Peterson's style alt-rightism.
And people have gotten mad at me before too for saying socialism shouldn't be based on your morality. And morality is really just a form of communication. And if your socialism is based on morality, you're going to be tricked into supporting the empire because they weaponize this moralizing language, right? Like, oh, Yugoslavia or Milosevic in Serbia is doing a genocide. So if you don't support NATO carpet bombing his country, destroying their industry, poisoning their agricultural sites, destroying power plants and hydroelectric plants that the people of Serbia and former Yugoslavia are dependent on, then you support genocide. You have to support destroying their whole country with bombs. Otherwise, you support genocide that the UN and the Hague said there was never any evidence for and cleared Milosevic of the charges that NATO used to justify the carpet bombing of his country. But the media and the American liberals and the politicians use moralizing language, weaponize moralizing language to make you feel like a bad person if you don't support it. Right. So even to this day, you have a bunch of socialists who support the NATO bombing of Yugoslavia, right? Because they're like, oh, there was a genocide going on. I'm a bad person. I'm an immoral person if I don't support this. And as I was explaining earlier on stream with Domenico Lacerdo's tree, socialists support self-determination, economic independence, and then civil and political rights, which grow out of self-determination and economic independence. Right? So this is a scientific way in which we decide, how we are against imperialism. We are against, the overthrow or the meddling and the self-determination of any country's people, or the meddling or destruction of their economic independence. NATO's carpet bombing of Yugoslavia both took their self-determination away, and by bombing 170 state-run factories, agricultural plants, power plants, whatever else, they massively harmed the people of Yugoslavia's right to economic independence, as did the U.S. sanctions and IMF and World Bank infiltration. So that's why we're against the NATO bombing, right? It's a scientific way of looking at it. There are material things that the U.S. was doing in Yugoslavia that we were against because they prevent the construction of socialism and overall human flourishing. Versus if I just look at everything with my morality, it's very easy for the American media to trick me, right? Oh, Milosevic is an evil dictator. We've never seen anything like him since Hitler. They kept comparing Milosevic to Hitler. He's Hitler, he's Hitler, he's Hitler, he's Hitler. If you don't support bombing him, you basically support Hitler. And, me as a new socialist looking at this with my morality, it's like, well, I'm a socialist. I don't support genocide. Socialists are, of course, against genocide. And of course, I'm against dictatorial governments. Of course, I'm against Hitler. So I must be against Milosevic and in favor of the NATO bombing, because you don't have a scientific way of analyzing these imperialist actions in which you can say, no, I'm against the NATO bombing, because even if Milosevic is doing a genocide, carpet bombing his country isn't going to help. The imperialists will obviously have ulterior motives for carpet bombing his country. They think that Yugoslavia's factories are competitors with theirs, or the Serbian factories are competitors with theirs. And they have all these social welfare programs set up to which allow the Serbian surplus to be reinvested in their people. And as U.S. multinationals, we want to siphon out that surplus. So just bomb all the state-run factories. And if you don't support it, you support genocide, right? You need more than just morality and feelings if you're going to make important and concrete political analysis and political determinations.
They are both just two different wings of the same civil religion. They are representing a schism of Western civil religion. Number 3, guilt pride is at the heart of wokeism. Let's listen to Christopher Mott.
Now, this also creates this weird, unstable narrative because a big part of social justice rhetoric around today and domestic politics is kind of about how America is this uniquely evil country that has this intense historical guilt. But so I can already hear a lot of people saying, I spelled out in the report, but I could see a lot of people who just read the summary could be saying well, how does that work, right? These are the same people that are reading White Fragility and talking about how they're born inherently with racism, it's the mark of Cain, inverted or whatever. But it's actually quite easy to see, because if you are uniquely a self-flagellant, if you will, if you are look how guilty I am, I'm just so guilty, I need to be punished, that type of worldview, it's very easy to see how you could turn that around and say, we have this important historical reckoning, and we're having it with our past, and we really encourage other countries to do the same thing. And of course, if other countries don't do the same thing, of course, because every country has a different history, every country has a different cultural context, has different problems with various minority groups within it. It's an open door in a way to criticize another country's domestic politics on the international level. And the more guilty and virtuous you appear, the more I think you can argue that point.
Here.
Yes, and this is something some of my Chinese friends have noticed, Chinese Marxists who operate now within the American left, or who have seen how American left circles operate. There's a competition to see who can be the most woke, right? To see who can be the most empathetic and the most self-flagellating, and talk about how America is literally the most uniquely horrific thing ever. There's nothing good that can be recaptured from our history, and the whole thing just needs to be burned and destroyed. Like that's the ultimate, woke position. It's like there's a competition going on between American leftists to virtue signal, and be the most woke rather than be the most pragmatic, right? Rather than looking at our current conditions and asking, okay, given America's horrible history of white supremacy and, capitalist imperialism, how can we combat this in the modern day? How can we be pragmatic and organize and do things in a way that actually helps us bring about an end to this? Instead of that materialist, pragmatic strategizing and analysis, there's just like an idealist, individualist competition to be like, well, my form of socialism is when literally all of the white people leave and go back to Europe and we burn America and we balkanize it. It's like, okay, maybe morally you think that because of the settler colonial genocide, all the white people should go back to Europe. But like pragmatically, materially, it's just not going to happen. So what's the point, right? Like we need to look at organizing the people who are here, the people who were born into the country in the modern era, uniting those people, uniting those workers, and uniting those struggles of different oppressed groups against the capitalist ruling class who currently dominates the imperial government. The imperium is they call it in this video. And if we're not even thinking about that, if we're not even thinking about organizing, or if, our wokest politics have brought us to the point where we think organizing, isn't even worth it. It's not even worth organizing people in America because it's just too far gone and we just need to wait for the country to collapse and devolve into civil war and be balkanized. Then you're not going to spend your energy and effort organizing, right? You think it's impossible. And even if you don't think it's impossible to organize socialism in this country, if you're distracted by just moralizing and by trying to, see more woke than your comrade, or hate America more than your comrade, like you're not thinking about pragmatic ways to organize. You're not thinking about how to organize your workplace. You're not thinking about the material things people in your community need. You're not thinking about how to get people mutual aid and theoretical education, right? As Jiangju said, who's one of my Marxist buddies from China, he's actually from Taiwan, who has been observing and criticizing the American left. He tweeted today, Eastern communists are pragmatic. Communists in China or Russia or the DPRK or whatever else, they're pragmatic. They're looking at how to bring their country forward, move their country forward, actually bring about self-determination for the working mass, and economic well-being. Versus communists in the West are idealist, right? We're talking about these ideal utopias that we'd like to turn America into, and criticizing and criticizing our friends for not using the right woke language or not, appealing to the same utopia that I want. And it's like, there are no utopias. This is what Marx was saying from day one. There are no utopias. We need to be pragmatic. Right. And this sort of individualist liberal competition to see who can hate America the most and be the most self-flagellating. It's not pragmatic and it's not going to actually bring about liberation for anyone, which is the whole point of this. Even though, I'm sure people will accuse Midwestern Marx of being anti liberation of various oppressed groups because we have a criticism of wokeism.
Mott very nicely summarizes the guilt pride logic, which is at the heart of wokeism. There are two things, though, that can be added to what.
Sorry. Thank you, Comrade 727, for giving me an example of what I was talking about. Yeah, like I said, a lot of leftists are just going to hear the word woke and then melt down.
Mott said. Number one, this guilt pride logic, I think quite clearly, has its roots in contemporary German Erinnerungskultur or memory culture, which is at the center of the new German reverse nationalism, which builds a sense of superiority, of moral superiority, and of a certain moralist political mission on the basis of not only accepting but publicly proclaiming guilt for the Holocaust. Secondly, it's quite clear that the guilt pride mechanism corresponds to Christian ideology. The admission of guilt or the admission of sin is at the same time the condition for the admission to heaven. It is.
Sorry, I didn't mean to cut him off there, but this I just thought of a good example, the black squares on Instagram. Everybody had to post a black square for BLM. It's like, if you didn't post a black square, are you really BLM? It's sort of everybody signaling support for, this sort of cultural reckoning, which, now the ruling class and the imperialists are co-opting wokeism and using it for empire. So, by getting everyone to signal their support for it, publicly signal their support for it, it's exactly what Hans-Georg Moeller is talking about. It's everyone, it's drawing everyone into this individualistic sort of liberal idealist identity politics competition to see who can be the most self-flagellating, when really, posting black squares on Instagram is just a personal thing. It's just a personal virtue signal for you to say, I am not a racist person, even though I live in a country founded on white supremacy. And it doesn't do anything to materially improve people's lives. It doesn't do anything to actually liberate oppressed groups. It doesn't do anything to actually make black people's lives better in America, or attack the militarized police system or the prison industrial complex, which preys on black people. All of these things are still functioning and still making money for the ruling class, as, we're posting black squares on Instagram like, look at me, I am so much more woke than my friend who didn't post the black square. It's just pure individualism and idealism.
Confession that cleanses the conscience of the confessor and makes him or her a better and superior person. Number 4, academics are the priests of wokeism. Mott writes, elite overproduction has increased the pool of humanities graduates beyond society's ability to employ them. And that's true. The academic industry produces fierce competition for fewer and fewer and less well-paid jobs inside and outside academia. And as Mott says, a systemic moralism has resulted from this, which is partly driven by a highly competitive professional class vying to secure their position in the system by using virtue signaling to demonstrate class solidarity to the higher ranks. So we've ended up with a new class of academic priests, a mass of educated intellectuals without proper function in the real economy, and they are becoming some form of self-reinforcing ideological class, competing for a few jobs with a currency of holiness virtue signaling.
So that's a very good and very Marxist analysis of how overproduction and control of production has created a lot of people around my age who are going into academia and getting degrees, but then, society doesn't have that many jobs for them once they get out. So it's also creating this crisis of student debt. But he's talking about the academics and the professors sort of being like the priests of this civil religion of wokeism. And I mean, at many institutions today, you basically, before getting a job in academia, you have to do a diversity statement. Basically, a statement saying how committed you are to woke politics, trying to get oppressed identities and oppressed identity groups into the college. Focusing, basically what they want you to do is recruit and try and get people to the college who are of minority groups or various oppressed identities, which isn't the worst thing ever. I think it would do a lot more to actually make college free, and cancel student debt and make college available to oppressed communities more so than it would to have the professors do this diversity statement or wokeism statement. But I don't think the purpose of it is to make sure that the academies are actually helping out oppressed groups, right? As Hans-Georg Moeller says, the idea is sort of to filter people out, right? In order to join this class of priests, this academic class of priests, you have to signal your adherence to wokeism, right? You have to signal your adherence to the struggle of different identity groups, which of course we support the struggle of different identity groups. But as I just said, I think the solutions are material, right? The solutions aren't me working for a college and then trying to be, less racist or more woke individually. It's good to combat your own racism and understand your own blind spots, especially when you grow up in a country founded on white supremacy and stuff. But what really is going to help get more oppressed groups into higher education is getting rid of the insane cost of higher education, right? Getting rid of the insane bubble of student debt that hangs over so many young Americans, including myself, right? If you cancel that and get rid of that, you're going to have, more opportunities for young people to go into higher education. But you're not allowed to make these material analyses, right? Or the academy isn't allowed to push for these material changes. They want you to push for just individualist, idealist, or as Hans-Georg Moeller would say, wokeist changes.
And using this currency for gaining professional recognition and competing for a few elite positions. Number 5, wokeism is militant. Let's listen to Mott again.
Also, I wanted to, since we're talking about institutions that are...
I don't know if you paid attention to that, but the German Green Party is a really interesting example of this.
Oh, well, Baerbock, exactly.
As a whole, yeah, they have a whole bunch of these people. It's very weird.
It's very interesting to hear Mott talking here about the Green Party. It's a very interesting historical case. When the Green Party was founded in the early 1980s, it had basically 2 ideological pillars. Number 1 was against nuclear power generation, and number 2, a radical pacifism. In this way, it distinguished itself from the 68 leftist movement, out of which it had grown, because the leftist movement, of course, focused on anti-capitalism, on somehow solidarity with the working class. That was not what the Green Party did. The Green Party instead was rooted in liberal German Protestantism, which is very different from American evangelical Protestantism. It's kind of very liberal, very progressive. And at that time, the Green Party's pacifism tied to Protestant, German, European religion also expressed itself in large anti-war demonstrations at the time, or better, anti-rearmament demonstrations, which were directed against NATO weapons being stationed in Germany. And I do remember the slogans of the time because I participated in some of these demonstrations myself, like Frieden schaffen ohne Waffen, make peace without weapons, or stell dir vor, es ist Krieg und keiner geht hin, imagine there's war and no one goes, or nie wieder Krieg, war never again. Now, recently, the Green Party in Germany has totally changed course. It shifted from its traditional pacifism to a new militarism. This dialectical shift, although it happened much faster, I think somehow mirrors a shift we also see in the history of Christianity, which also began with pacifism and an emphasis on non-violence and peace and love, and then ended up in crusades and with violence against heathens and even non-conformist Christians during the Inquisition. In Germany, we saw in the person of the foreign minister, Green Party foreign minister Baerbock, and the Green Party vice chancellor Habeck, we see this shift happening very quickly in early 2022 at the occasion of the Russian war against Ukraine. At the beginning of the war, the Green Party representatives still said, we are against delivering weapons to a war zone. They very rapidly shifted tone and are now among the prime advocates for sending heavy weaponry to Ukraine. And they're very much behind the remilitarization of Germany, and actually reinvested 100 billion euros into the German army. At the same time, also for military purposes and for the purpose of making war against Russia, the Green Party is now advocating a temporary, at least, the return to coal energy, and is even considering a return temporary to nuclear power generation to make up for the gas or the oil that is no longer purchased from Russia. This amazing and very fast ideological shift shows again, I think, that Mott has a very strong point. Wokeism is now used as the ideology justifying and supporting an emphasis on military confrontation. Somewhat ironically, this shift is still officially labeled by the Green Party as wertegeleitete Außenpolitik, value-based foreign policy.
I've given so many materialist examples of wokeism being used to justify imperialism in the US, but this might be the best one, and the one that, as Hans-Georg Moeller says shows the dialectical shift. Shows the imperium or the empire shifting towards wokeism to justify their aggression, and social democrats, sort of like the Green Party or so-called leftists, lining up with the ruling class and with the empire in times of crisis, right? Which is what we talked about at the beginning of the stream, how social democrats always side with fascists and imperialists, like the Azov battalion and the Nazis in Ukraine, armed and funded by NATO. And we saw this shift in the Green Party, who were previously against NATO armament, but then as soon as it became trendy, and as soon as the U.S. was saying we need to attack Russia because they're, not only are they invading Ukraine, but they're also anti-Western, right? They're anti-Western, they're anti-woke. They still like socialism because of the Soviet Union. They're just, completely opposed to liberal democracy and our values. And there was even a West German commentator on TV, who let slip, basically saying, we need to keep in mind this is Russia. Russia's not like the rest of Europe. They don't have our level of civilization and our values. And this is exactly what Hans-Georg Moeller is talking about. We are woke. We are civilized, and we need to civilize the non-woke hordes, and this used to be Christianity. Right? We have our values and we have civilization here in Europe, in the white man's land, but elsewhere they don't, and that's why we need to carry it out and bring Christianity to these other places, bring our values to these other places. And now you're seeing, like with the Green Party, this material example, the same exact thing is happening with wokeism. They're shifting from an anti-war stance, a materialist, anti-NATO, anti-rearmament stance, into, value-based imperialism. Really, the Green Party is shifting towards leading with our values, meaning idealism, utopianism, wokeism, and which, of course, as Hans-Georg Moeller says, lends itself perfectly to imperialism in the modern era. And the main conflict of imperialism versus anti-imperialism right now, the U.S.-led proxy war in Ukraine. Oh, got a super chat. Thank you so much. If feudal lords in Marx's view were a hereditary traditional elite opposed by the progressive systems, is wokeism about reproducing this? Traditional elite opposed by the progressive class system, is wokeism about? Is wokeism reproducing the progressive class system, or is wokeism reproducing the hereditary traditional elite? Are you saying that wokeism reproduces the elites, the posed by the progressive class system? Yeah. Just clarify for me what you mean. But thank you so much for the $5. You see Ted Cruz slam Latin socialist countries and Marxists. Thank you, Left is Best. I did see that. It's literally the next video we're gonna watch. So yeah, let me just finish this up. Let me finish up this video about wokeism, and then I will answer all your questions. Thank you so much for the $10, though. Reproducing the progressive class system's destruction of the traditional elite. I think wokeism is being used by the elite, right? Wokeism is being co-opted and utilized by the elite to justify their materialist imperialism, their economic expansion, and their control of markets and resources abroad. So I don't know if it's reproducing anything from feudalism. I would say it's a reproduction or a sublation of Christianity, as Hans-Georg Moeller says, of the Christian faith that feudal lords, even, I mean, they used whatever faith was popular in their region or at their time, but especially the early capitalist imperialists, like the British, said we need to spread civilization to Africa or Christianity to Africa. I think wokeism is a reappearance of that idea in a new and secular form.
Clearly, the values that are employed here are woke values, and clearly the foreign policy is a foreign policy that is geared towards militarism. Where is the Friedrich Nietzsche today in Germany, who points to the deep ambiguity of this emphasis on Werte or values?
Great video as always. He's such a good philosopher, Hans-Georg Moeller is. Please check out his work. Check out his other videos about wokeism. And yeah, he ends it there with exactly what we've been talking about the whole video and with the way he started the video. This is just value-based idealism or utopianism being used to justify imperialism. So, this is another form, a sublation, another version of what they've always done. Our values are different from their values. We need to attack them and spread our values to them, whether it be our Christian values, which have given us civilization according to the imperialists. We need to spread them. Or whether it's human rights. We're not going to actually define what we mean by human rights materially. We're just going to accuse country A of abusing human rights, and therefore we're justified in doing whatever we want against them. Idealist value, or it's the empire using idealist values to justify materialist aggression. That is basically what wokeism has become, and how it's become co-opted by the ruling class.